what we may see on the outside speaks to me to a shift in our consciousness as we become more aware of and more expanded in our awareness of what we're creating in the world. As quantum physics discovers or rediscovers that the very act of focusing on something or thinking about something creates that something. That our world of matter is simply a world of waves and particles that expand and collapse depending on what we pay attention to, what we focus on. And as that understanding begins to emerge, of course, our understanding of ourselves and our world and what we're doing here in it also begins to change. So I wanted to talk about that a little more, particularly in the idea or the concept of the hero. The hero. Because, of course, every story has a hero or a protagonist. But what does it mean to be a hero? And I thought it was an interesting thing to talk about on a number of different levels. Obviously, we're right around the corner from Memorial Day, and that's a day when we celebrate the heroes of our wars who have lost their lives protecting us in one way or another. Those are one kind of heroes. But it's also the kickoff of the summer movie season. And the summer movie season tends to be jam-packed with heroes, superheroes, as a matter of fact, in the movies. And so I wanted to talk about that because you may have noticed that there is certainly a huge cycle of successful superhero films every summer, and even around the holidays, Christmas and Thanksgiving, we see new and bigger superhero action films coming out. And if you're not a fan, I understand. But what I can tell you about these films, many of them, are that they are telling some very complex stories. Many of them are based from comic books of the type that I used to love to read, or have loved to read since I was a kid. Marvel Comics and their line of superheroes, which includes Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk and Captain America and Iron Man. They have now very successfully made their transition to the big screen in a very big way. Comic books have always told rather complex stories in rather simple ways, because they are pictures, of course. But the stories, because they evolve over time, become quite entwined and quite complex. You have crossover stories where, for instance, in the Marvel universe, you have Captain America working with Spider-Man, or the Hulk working with Iron Man. So you have different heroes' stories coming together and creating another story. So this is being now brought to the screen in a way. And you heard me mention the Marvel Universe. This is how these characters and the stories they are involved in are referred to as a universe. So you have the Marvel Universe, based on stories from the Marvel comics. You have the DC universe, which is based on the brand of comics called DC. DC Comics were really the first comic books. They are the publishers of Superman and Batman, and they began way back in the 1930s. Whereas the Marvel comic books are a newer brand. They really came to prominence in the late 50s and early 60s, early 1960s, with a kind of different idea about what a hero was. In the beginning part of the comic book history, in the 1930s, when DC Comics was rising, and Superman was their top hero, followed by Batman. Heroes were Avengers. They were lone, powerful people who would sweep in and save the day, if you will, because they could do things that other people couldn't do, and they were superhuman. They were beyond being human. And so they were, seen as larger than life, and not susceptible to the foibles that the everyday person has. Well, in the 60s, when Marvel really came into being, their stable of characters like Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk and the Fantastic Four, which I believe was probably the first, besides Captain America. They began to explore the idea of the flawed hero, heroes that weren't really heroes, or heroes that struggle, heroes that have weaknesses, heroes that show us who we are and exemplify our struggles. So, with a trend of heroes being more like us and less like some kind of outside force. And of course, it's been noted, and it's quite true, that comic books have become the modern day mythology. In fact, many of them, such as Thor, for instance, are actually based on certain types of mythology. And they draw upon mythological themes, for sure. But they create their own sort of versions of this mythology. Similar in a way to the way that, the Roman gods and Roman mythology drew heavily upon Greek mythology, which had come before it. When the Romans took over, they sort of subsumed the mythology of the Greeks because of the stories that they believed in and loved. Well, in this day and age, when we have kind of a different way of seeing things, this very materialistic age that we live in, where we don't leave a lot of room for mythological tales, or we take our mythology and we make dogma from it, turning them into religions that we fight wars over, or at least define our lives and attempt to define other people's lives by. But we don't have the kind of, mythology or understanding of mythology and its meaning and its power that we had when, the Greeks and the Romans and even before that, indigenous cultures who shared stories, mythological stories, that had great meaning. Nowadays, people are focused on, well, the story is true or it's not true. It's fiction or it's non-fiction. And the idea of mythology is that these are stories that have truth behind them, that are telling truth. But they may not be empirically accurate, if you will. But we've lost the idea to kind of differentiate between that. But comic books are giving that back to us. And these comic book heroes that are so popular in the movies now, and they're really popular, and it's not just kids that are going to see them. It's grown-ups too. It's those of us who grew up with these stories, reading these stories in comic books, and seeing them very convincingly brought to the screen is very exciting. It's very exciting to see the stories that you've spent much of your life enjoying and watching evolve really get told in a new and different way on screen, where you can participate in a much better way. It took a very long time for that to happen. Comic book movies didn't do very well for a very long time because there just wasn't the technology to pull them off convincingly. So there were a few. There was in the 80s, there was the first Superman movie with Christopher Reeve. You might know about that. And then there was, at the end of the 80s, there was Batman. Sort of a kind of introducing of the Batman character. Bringing him back to sort of the darker character that he was originally in the comic books, because as you might well know, in the 60s the TV series Batman became quite a phenomenon, and it was a very sort of lighthearted, satirical, kind of goofy look at Batman, and the Batman hero in that series it's almost a tongue-in-cheek characterization of the stand-up good guy hero who trusts and motivates all the fine citizens of Gotham City and encourages them to follow the rules and all of those sorts of things. And that's kind of it was kind of a satirical look at that type of hero. And now, of course, we've seen this come full circle. We have heroes that are very conflicted about what they're there to do. We have people with powers who may or may not use them heroically. The superhero genre now is more about finding your own power, finding your own ability, and how do you use that, and how do you make the best use of it, and what does it call upon you to do. So hence you hear, in the popular vernacular now, people talking about what their superpower is, because these movies aren't talking about heroes that come in and sweep in and save the day anymore. They're talking about us. They're talking about our journey, the hero's journey. Some of you may be familiar with that phrase.